as I said, I very much appreciate this invitation. I'm currently in the, after having done research in other places, kind of come back to Ethiopia. So this is actually a great opportunity for me to kind of reconnect with some issues that I've been thinking about for a long time. So let me, I'll just read the paper. I think it'll go for about 40 or 50 minutes. In analyzing the Ethiopian Revolution and the student movement that took place in the country in the 1960s, a series of concepts, the modern, modernist, modernity, seem inevitably to come into play. This was obvious in the title of my book that Diego's just mentioned, Marxist Modern, published in 1999. There, working through local materials, I showed how ideas of what constituted the modern interacted dialectically with concepts that define, quote, tradition, unquote, as well as the anti-modern. My analysis rested on the proposition that what made Marxism attractive to Ethiopian actors was not its supposed internal meaning, however that might be understood, but by the way it allowed Ethiopian actors to create a vision of a more hopeful future in a present seemingly immobilized by an outmoded past. All of these factors understood at a particular moment of global history. Context was everything. As I said, I was working from empirical materials outward to what might be called middle level theory. Here, I'd like to consider these issues somewhat more abstractly. I believe there are a few things I can state more clearly today. And of course, new work on the Ethiopian Revolution and the student movement has increased dramatically. The conversation on theories of modernity that was so prominent in the 1990s as the book came out has now more or less subsided. But I would call attention especially to Webb Keene's important 2007 work, Christian Moderns, Freedom and Fetish in the Mission Encounter. In the following, I will highlight some very broad patterns in Ethiopian history and beyond, but the crucial one with which I'd like to begin is the range of cultural responses that can be inspired by collective feeling of backwardness, of living in exhausted times. Now today, we often associate those feelings with areas of the world outside Europe. But in fact, they seem, if anything, to have originated in Europe itself. Perhaps the best known example presented by Isaiah Berlin, among others, is Germany after the French Revolution. By the 18th century, France had become one of the most powerful states in Europe. While just next door, what we now think of as Germany was only a divided series of weak and seemingly outmoded principalities, provincial outposts of the Holy Roman Empire. The Germans were behind, or at least they felt themselves to be so. According to Berlin, such feelings congealed into what amounted to a, quote, national inferiority complex in regard to the French. Again, quoting Berlin, the French, that brilliant, glittering state which had managed to crush and humiliate them, that great country which dominated the sciences and the arts and all the provinces of human life with a kind of arrogance and success unexampled hitherto. But as so often is the case, that structure of feeling, to use literary critic Raymond Williams's phrase, provoked a variety of quite complex ambivalences and ambiguities. After all, German philosophy was the best in the world, at least according to the Germans. And in that context, Romanticism arose in German philosophy precisely to present itself as an altogether worthy, indeed superior, alternative to French rationalism. In other words, the reaction to being behind, quote unquote, can involve more than an attempt to catch up by borrowing from those ahead, although that move is common enough. It can also offer more radical possibilities of questioning just what being ahead means. Notice that a culturally differentiated sense of space is crucial to the complex I'm discussing. Imagine that there had been no cultural boundary between Germany and France. Then there would have been no, quote, humiliation, much less a reactive claim to a differently defined superiority. So a sense of time inevitably comes interrelated with a definition of space to produce what Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin called a time-space, a chronotope. This narrative binding of time with space is illustrated in the letters of mid-19th century Ethiopian Emperor Tewodros II to the British monarch Queen Victoria. According to Baruzaudi, Tewodros was, quote, Ethiopia's first monarch with a concept, however vague, of modernization. In Tewodros's letter, he pleads for technical aid from the British by unashamedly presenting himself and Ethiopians as behind the times, as, quote, blind, ignorant, and even more extravagantly, as blind asses. But the notion of the modern does not always involve the influence of an economically and politically more powerful other. Though, of course, once again, that constitutes a common pattern. For an exception, let me turn to European art in the early 20th century. Picasso and the Cubist, and even more clearly later, the Surrealist, turned in exactly the opposite direction, to the arts of the supposedly most primitive regions of the globe, Africa especially. One can say that for the Surrealists, it was precisely the overly refined, desiccated state of European art at the time that had led it to neglect what they saw in African art, the magical powers of images, the subterranean pool of passions. That this attraction to the idea of the primitive involved all kinds of misunderstandings is, of course, clear. But that perhaps is the point. Many of the dialogical encounters that I'm analyzing, at least in retrospect, seem to rest upon some central misunderstanding, one nevertheless useful in imagining a livelier future. Whatever the modern is thought to be, it seems never to present a clean and absolute rejection of the past. Doing so would obliterate the basis of historical identity. That is, there would be no way of constituting either Germanness, say, or Frenchness. Ironically, then, the notion of the modern seems to require another one, its opposite category, namely tradition. But the modern does not merely come after and react to tradition. Rather, I think, to some significant degree, the modern actually constructs tradition. I say this because without the provocation of the modern, tradition may not exist as a self-conscious construct. It can be rather a taken for granted doxa in Pierre Bourdieu's vocabulary, one in which people live without too much awareness. To illustrate how the notion of the modern summons a notion of tradition, consider Elizabeth Wolde-Georgis's recent description of Skender Bokassian's obsession with Ethiopian magical scrolls. Painted by religious specialist Debtera on animal skin parchments, the scrolls were stared at fixedly by a patient until the images and writing penetrated and cured the sick person's body. Eyes were the aperture through which his medicine entered the body. Fascinated by this practice, Skunder scraped off the surfaces of parchment scrolls and superimposed his own drawings. But often the outlines of the debtör's previous work remained visible as a ghostly palimpsest. This kind of drawing over without full erasure seems to me to capture a prominent dynamic of the modern. In Skunder's case, the debtör's prior work was critical in rendering his modernism as identifiably Ethiopian. Now, clearly these kinds of dialogues depend on communicative connection with the world outside of people's direct experience. They are, as we say, mediated. They require either travel or education or the ability to read foreign texts to understand foreign languages. But it's crucial to note that linguistic mediation is not absolutely required. The feeling of being behind can be mediated by objects other than linguistic signs. For example, when I began research in Mali and southern Ethiopia, just as the Ethiopian Revolution commenced in the 1970s, only a handful of local people, literally no more than 3 or 4, were literate, mostly in Amharic, and to much lesser degree, English. Yet it could be said that firearms constituted a kind of medium that conveyed a graduated sense of being behind, even to illiterate Mali peasants. By the early 1970s, there were still old rifles from Italy and Belgium in Mali, as well as newer British ones, in addition to still newer American and Russian arms. None of these, Mali emphasized, had been made in Ethiopia itself, much less in Mali. I was repeatedly asked whether I, as an American, knew how to make firearms. And a palpable sense of disappointment followed when I said I could not. This array of weapons was understood as being structured by gradation of ever more power and efficiency, ever more, quote, modern characteristics. The Mali at that point did not have a word that directly translates into the modern, but they expressed the essential component of it with the notion of besting or supersession, bashani. British rifles bested Italian and Belgian ones, and American and Russian ones beat British ones. And this succession of objects was used by Mali to organize layers of time, in which the first appearance of different kinds of arms provided a kind of historical scaffolding for the past. Notice that whatever is taken as modern at one moment will inevitably be overtaken by a new definition. I think there's no more poignant illustration of that than Haile Selassie himself. He began, of course, in the 20s and 30s as Ethiopia's most prominent modernist, but by the 50s and 60s had turned into exactly the opposite for many people. That is perhaps why art historians refer now to Cubism not as modern, but as modernist. That last term usefully emphasizes the element of self-consciousness involved in these dialogical encounters. Modernists are aware of various extant possibilities, most notably tradition, and they plot their escape from them. And the modern is always defined in relation to a particular point in space. At other spatial locations, the putatively modern may be taken merely as tradition, that which needs to be superseded, surpassed. The central feature of what makes me call my Bakhtinian approach to these interrelationships is the argument that the notion of the modern operate like deictic, or more broadly, indexical elements in ordinary speech acts, hence my title, The Indexicality of Modern. The typical examples of deixis in English are terms like now and then, or here and there. If we consider, for example, the meaning of there, it depends entirely on context. It's the context that allows people to infer what in that particular situation there refers to. There's no unitary aspect of there-ness. The idea of the modern, it strikes me, operates similarly. And therefore, the attempt to understand it requires, first of all, a decoding of the spatial and temporal context in which it's mobilized via different kinds of media. This means, I think, that the initial role of an analyst is in no way different from any listener who must decipher indexical references like here and there. Notions of the modern and of modernists then seem to offer reasonably accurate translations of local cultural concepts over many spatial locations in the world today. Indeed, it's difficult to imagine any place now entirely without them. I think this is actually, I would emphasize how actually peculiar this is. Webb Keen, in fact, has emphasized that this ubiquity is itself noteworthy and calls out for some explanation. Now, if one thinks about that in relation to world history, certainly it seems to be that this hasn't always been the case. At some previous point in world history, most cultures seem to imagine themselves as the only way that fully human beings could live, a measure that rendered other cultures as ipso facto inferior in some way, and therefore, in some sense, uninteresting. Exactly when and at what point in space this changed, when people began to live not only in reference to their own cultural standards, but vis-a-vis others, it seems to me an incredibly interesting question, but beyond my competence. I would guess that the development of the world capitalist system, if it does not furnish some, if it doesn't furnish the origin of the cultural conversations I'm discussing, is certainly its essential context over the last 5 centuries. After all, capitalism as a social system literally cannot exist without continually revolutionizing its own production. And that aspect of capitalism, in fact, I think, contrasts with everything before it. This does not mean, of course, that modernists are necessarily embedded in local forms of capitalism. Often they are not. And that's precisely the point. Recall Baruzaudi's influential discussion of early 20th century Ethiopian intellectuals. Certainly at that point, Ethiopia wasn't capitalist, but these intellectuals by the early 20th century, in Baru's account, are looking around to other examples in the world, like Japan, for example, who had made a successful capitalist transition. I come then to the concept of modernity. The transformation of an adjective, modern, into a noun, modernity, seems innocent enough. Notice, in the context of what I've just laid out, the effects of such a change. It turns our attention from indexicality and contextual variation to a supposedly unitary state of social being, modernity. A similar type of operation often, again, occurs in ordinary speech and has been called by linguists intextualization. In some respects, the exact opposite of indexicality, intextualization creates a supposedly unitary bit of text that can move across context. This is quoting Webb Keen again. The process commonly involves elimination of linguistic features that anchor any stretch of discourse in some immediate context, such as pronouns, temporal and spatial indexes, references that depend on shared knowledge between interlocutors, and so forth. These chunks of discourse or text can thereby circulate and be recontextualized, inserted into new contexts. Now, the modernity, it seems to me, is certainly a species of intextualization. But of course, social theory is not ordinary discourse. It's a meta-discourse, a discourse about discourses, one with, therefore, special ambitions. It aims to provide an accurate account of different social worlds. And this is where the notion of modernity, it seems to me, can be especially problematic, not to say disabling. Does modernity require, for example, the rejection of religion and the celebration of the secular? Or can religion itself be incorporated into modernity by eliminating traditional practices and beliefs not authorized by science? Or sometimes even by weeding out practice and belief not authorized in original sacred texts? What, in any case, is the secular? You can see that these are the kinds of questions, I think, that have accumulated around the kind of the problematic nature of modernity. These questions illustrate, I think, some of modernity's incoherence as an attempt at social science. According to Keen, modernity is certainly a word in danger of meaning everything and nothing. Taken as the outcome of a teleological narrative, any particular characterization of modernity faces a complex and unpredictable world brimming with counterexamples. What makes us think history should have a single narrative, yet to pluralize modernities invites self-contradiction. Given modernity's genealogy as a totalizing categories, how could such a plurality of other modernities or alternative modernities be rendered coherent? My own strategy is to resist the intextualization that modernity inevitably seems to invite. I think it's really interesting to kind of think about why it should be so inviting. Even Webb Keen himself, after having said what he says about modernity, uses it through his entire book. It seems to me if modernity has any content at all, I would say that it merely points to a social situation in which conversation about the modern have assumed a certain thickness. Gertrude Stein said famously of Oakland, her childhood home and my current residence in California, there is no there. I believe we can say the same of modernity. There is no there. And the doubling of indexes is perhaps ironically appropriate. The original meaning of Stein's clever phrase referred to the completely changed scene of her childhood home when visited by Gertrude decades later. The original large house had been torn down and the expansive 10-acre lot carved up into a new subdivision. There was no there, no there that Gertrude could identify by memory. But that is not, of course, how the saying is often interpreted now. now is taken as the ultimate modernist put down, that Oakland does not have the qualities of, say, San Francisco, not to mention Gertrude's Paris. The point I'm arguing is that modernist claims are simply speech acts made in particular context. Hearing them, we do not need necessarily to develop an elaborate theory about how the cultural and social structure of Paris is fundamentally different from that of Oakland, or of the supposed evolutionary process by which Oakland might yet turn into Paris if only its benighted citizens joined the avant-garde. Rather, to transform another of Gertrude's famous lines, we might state instead, a claim is a claim is a claim is a claim. If there's one association now with the place that Oakland occupies with respect to the arts, it's the misinterpretation of Gertrude's phase as modernist condescension. Never mind that the art scene in Oakland is now, in fact, more vibrant than that of San Francisco, if for no other reason than young artists can't afford to live in San Francisco. But the supposed put down has spawned all matter of artistic response. One is an outdoor sculpture on the border between Oakland and Berkeley. 2 8-foot-high tall metal words, here, H-E-R-E, and with the addition of only one letter, there, T-H-E-R-E. So as one enters Berkeley from Oakland, one sees here, while entering Oakland from the opposite direction, he or she sees there. The artists seem to be giving Oakland the there that Gertrude Stein had claimed it did not have, all the while celebrating the relativity of Deixis. I followed it out in more detail than you're perhaps interested in. The ramifications of this conversation about Oakland to illustrate the cascading nature of claims and counterclaims that it seems to me that all modernist dialogues seem to inspire. So what finally is the anti-modern? To provide an illustration, let me return to Marx's modern. There I described the background of North American missionaries who arrived in southern Ethiopia in the 1930s. So-called fundamentalist Christians, they explicitly rejected modern interpretations of Christianity that had begun in the 19th century to read the scriptures in a way that harmonized them with scientific knowledge from history and archaeology, say. In reaction, fundamentalists insisted on the literal truth of the Bible, and particularly on its prophetic account of human temporality. Instead of the ever-improving time that modernists anticipated, anti-modern Christians knew that the end of time was nigh, that at any moment now Christ could return to earth for the final judgment. That end would come, however, only after the gospel had been preached to the ends of the earth. This account of end times led fundamentalist evangelists to take up their mission to Ethiopia in to southern Ethiopia in the 1930s to participate in and advance God's grand design. But even though they rejected any hint of modernism with regard to their religion, they self-consciously used other aspects of the modern, like automobiles, airplanes, and particularly medicine. This is perhaps the essence of the anti-modern, it seems to me. A rejection of the modern that's nonetheless in crucial ways rooted in the modern, rather than tradition, for example. But the missionaries and their religion were hardly interpreted as anti-modern by Ethiopians in the South. Their missionaries lived at a level of wealth that even the most powerful local representatives of the state, for example, could not match. By the 1950s, missionaries arrived at their stations in airplanes. They laid out the landing field, in fact, that Ethiopian Airlines would eventually use in Jinka. They provided medicines for diseases like malaria that seemed miraculous, sometimes insisting that those medicines would not work unless patients believed in Jesus Christ. To local Ethiopians in the South, then, missionaries and their religion represented a kind of high modernism as an opening to a wider world of power and wealth that conveniently bypassed their Orthodox Christian conquerors from the north from the 19th century. Conversion then was a fundamentally modernist affair in the context of southern Ethiopia. Protestant conversion I'm talking about. One of the things that we might talk about in the question and answer is actually now Orthodox conversion, which is fascinating to me. Later, when the revolution arrived in the South during the mid-1970s, it presented yet another and now antagonistic modernist project, focused now on Marxism. Christian converts were primed to respond, as it were. Under pressure, some left the church, and when the Workers' Party was organized in Mali in the 1980s, all of its members were ex-evangelicals. Once again, the supposed internal content of the modern was hardly determinative. But the particular way it shaped time, it seems to me, was critical. The continuity of that temporalization from one modernism to the next lubricated an altogether surprising transition. Evangelical Christians became Ethiopian Marxists. There is by now a huge literature on the connection between Protestantism, capitalism, and colonialism. Often these connections are presented as functional, as religion responding to some postulated functional need of capitalism or colonialism, or to reverse the directionality, capitalism being created, at least in the beginning, by some particular kind of religious doctrine. But in southern Ethiopia, Protestant conversion hardly yielded capitalism. Rather, it eventually helped to create Ethiopian socialism. To be able to understand these peculiar transitions requires, I think, not just functional approaches, but a semiotic appreciation of how chronotopes set up expected futures, how they create presumed teleologies that underwrite particular patterns of social action. The processes that result sometimes combine what, in other terms, certainly are strange bedfellows. To conclude, let me consider how much the world in which Ethiopia is embedded has changed since the 1970s. Then there were two great claims to the future and to the modern, one centered on the United States, the other on the Soviet Union, one on liberalism, the other on communism. Since the US had done so much to prop up Haile Selassie, and by that point, his, quote, backwardness, unquote. Remember that more US aid went to Ethiopia at that point than all of the rest of Africa combined. liberalism had been corrupted in the eyes of many in the Ethiopian student movement by the 1960s. Marxism and the apparent successes of the Russian and Chinese revolutions mapped out an alternative future. That bipolar world has now utterly collapsed. The US is currently in the throes of a significant anti-modernist reaction, one in which even medical science is mocked, in which the supposedly rational procedures of the liberal state are being replaced by the circulation of conspiracy theories. If there's not much for Ethiopian modernists to emulate in the US in 2021, that's hardly the case with respect to China and the Asian tigers. Indeed, those authoritarian successes seemed, until recently, to furnish the model of a developmental state in Ethiopia and for what was termed the Ethiopian Renaissance. An interesting temporal context. What once was great, being great again. But over the last few years, that vision has been rejected by important sections of Ethiopians for its association with the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. So what will presently replace the modernism of the developmental state in Ethiopia? A populist anti-modernism? Or yet another modernism? Like a great many Ethiopians, I certainly do not know. The outcome will be undergirded by more than just a dialectic of abstracted ideas. For chronotopes, like languages in the well-known aphorism, remember that languages, the difference between a language and a dialect is that languages have an army. Well, chronotopes have armies, and armies have chronotopes. Whatever happens, the dialogical form of analysis that I've tried to argue for here will continue, I think, to provide a necessary framework for understanding how Ethiopian actors themselves understand their time space with respect to world history, and how they, at least in some respects, produce their futures and correspondingly their pasts. So I would be very interested in your questions or comments. Looks like it's exactly 45 minutes, so that seems good. So I'll hand it back to Diego.
Right.